Good morning. It is Sunday, February 11th, Super Bowl Sunday. I'm reading this morning from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9, verses 2 through 9. I'm at a park, and it's really foggy over the river back there, which is appropriate, and you'll find out why later. The scene opens with Jesus telling his disciples what's about to happen to him. We're only in chapter 9, about halfway through Mark's gospel, and he lets them know that he is probably going to suffer and die, and things are going to happen to them that are less than comfortable, and it's not a great start to a story on a foggy Sunday morning in February. But as the camera pans around the campfire to all the disciples, confusion is clearly on their face. But right after this baffling revelation that he's going to leave them, he stands up, Jesus does, and invites three of his friends, Peter, James, and John, to go up a mountainside with him. And up there, in the fog at the top of the mountain, an extraordinary revelation unfolds. And that's kind of underselling it. The camera pans the sky, and the sun is behind the clouds. And suddenly everything goes dark. And it's not the fog. It's just everything goes dark. And Jesus himself becomes like the sun, dazzling white, bright like the sun. And the only way to describe it, the disciples say, is that he is transfigured before them, changing from one physical condition to another physical condition. His face bright like the sun, his clothes dazzling, radiantly white. And then suddenly the group goes from 4 people to 6 people because Moses and Elijah show up at the top of the mountain, as if they were physically alive again, standing right there with the disciples. And what are they doing? They're just standing there. They're just standing there talking to Jesus, their friend, Jesus. And it's miraculous and it's weird. And the disciples see right in front of them the pillars of the law and the prophets and their friend Jesus talking. And once their hearts stop pounding out of their chests, Peter says, well, let's build a booth, a tent. Let's stay the night. Let's hang out here longer. But they head on back down the mountain. And in their group, the only way that they can even make sense of it is just this feeling that Jesus is truly and undeniably special. In the movie Good Will Hunting, Will is a janitor at MIT, and he's cleaning the classrooms, and he comes in and he sees this extravagantly difficult math problem, and he just does the chalk and solves it. This complex problem. And we're introduced to Will's intellect, and we don't understand why he's doing what he's doing when he can do what he can do. So flashbacks in the movie reveal his difficult childhood and his time in foster care and how he pushes people away in his life because he doesn't want to deal or confront his past. And his past and his present converge when Will gets into a fight and he faces jail time. But he's offered a deal. If you go to counseling, if you spend some time with a therapist, you don't have to go to prison. So Will meets Sean McGuire, the therapist. The resistance and the skepticism begin to fall off. They begin to bond. And he has a revelation, Will does, that he is special. Will is special. And he's going to be okay if he chooses to be okay. In the movie Good Will Hunting, Matt Damon is Will, the janitor. But his genius isn't enough. It takes therapy, it takes conversation, it takes guidance from his mentor to become healthy. And the bulk of the movie is about Will confronting his demons and learning to embrace his potential. And every time I see it, I wonder how much of my life could be described like that. Lent starts this week, this time before the celebration of Easter. And it's time to reflect on our commitments and our priorities, to do a self-evaluation, and think about who we are and what we do and how we do it. See, by the end of this movie, Will experiences profound personal growth, and he chooses a brighter future over his self-destructive past. It's a choice for him to recognize the gifts that he has. And it sounds a lot like Peter's reaction to Jesus' little meeting with Elijah and Moses. Overwhelmed with this divine spectacle, Peter just wants to hang out there. Let's spend time, Jesus, Moses, Elijah, and the boys. And it's a gesture born out of reverence and awe, but it's also completely naive and ignorant of what's happening in the moment. In his defense, how could Peter possibly understand? But his response, I think, reveals a human tendency to see the extraordinary and attempt to define it by what we've already experienced. To see something miraculous and downplay it and put it into a confinement in our minds within our own ordinary experiences. Maybe that's why the gospel writers called it a transfiguration, a physical change, instead of a transformation, a spiritual or soulful kind of change. I can't use a regular word to describe what just happened here. See, we understand transformation. We've all seen the cocoon turn into a butterfly. Anybody who's ever had a puppy knows what it's like to see this animal transform into this adult dog. We understand crawling, to walking, to running, to talking, to thinking, to acting, to learning, to growing, to becoming who we are now, transformed from one thing to another thing. But I think Scripture tries to elevate our thinking on this, about this event, using the word transfiguration, trying to describe something that's beyond the ordinary, beyond what we've already experienced, beyond what we could possibly know. Oh, and the kicker, of course, is when they're up there, God's voice comes out of the fog. This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him. Jesus is unique and amazing, and his relationship with God is something worth thinking about. See, that's the thing. We see things we haven't seen before, and sometimes we're speechless, standing there in awe, but sometimes we're like Peter, and we just can't shut up about it. Did I tell you? Did I tell you? Did I tell you? But what does God say to do? Listen to him. I wonder how many times the extraordinary has happened right in front of me and I didn't notice. How many times the voice of God has spoken to me and I did not hear it. Instead of listening, I do everything but. Try something different? Listen. Meet someone new? Listen. Trying something new? Listen. Dealing with a difficult situation? Listen. Faced with the overwhelming presence of God, the disciples fall to the ground in fear. I mean, it's a natural response to something that, meeting the divine. Scholars say this moment highlights the tension between human frailty and the holiness of God. True, but I think this story highlights that we aren't God. And it reminds us of our need for humility and reverence. We could use some humbleness, some modesty. We could use some listening time. In the movie Good Will Hunting, there are these therapy sessions, and Will's defenses are gradually broken down over time, and they explore his abandonment and his trust issues and his insecurities. And it took listening through all of that to recognize who Will was now. He had defined himself as this other his whole life. To experience the breakthrough, it took listening. In tender compassion, when they're down from the mountain, Jesus touches his disciples, urging them not to be afraid. And that gesture stops everything. And suddenly, the readers reading Mark's gospel, we understand that Jesus is the bridge between what we don't know and what we need to know, the bridge between humanity and divinity, the bridge between loss and comfort. And we need that bridge to understand who we are now. See, that's the thing about transformation. It takes us from where we are now to where we need to be. Assurance in the middle of darkness, promise in the middle of fear and uncertainty. Even in our darkest moments, the presence of God brings light. I don't think it's just thrown in to the narrative that Jesus becomes dazzling white in that moment. Bright, bright light. I think the reason I like Good Will Hunting movie is that it shows how we can do what Jesus did on that mountaintop. He embraced his potential. He understood who he was. Will begins to embrace his potential, seeing new opportunities beyond his current circumstances by listening. And he starts to make positive changes in his life. Once he stops and listens, he can change. Overcoming obstacles, the power of perseverance, all those themes play out in this movie. And they play out in this story from Jesus. When we face challenges, personal, professional, social, we're presented with opportunities to grow, opportunities for self-discovery and transformation. That's what this story about Jesus climbing a mountain with his friends is all about. It's about the mountains that we climb. So why did the transfiguration happen, this extraordinary event at the top of the mountain in the fog? Of course, it's confirmation of Jesus' identity as the Son of God. Of course, it's about the fulfillment of God's promises to love and care for us because he sent his Son, Jesus. But in the moment, I think it was just an eye-opener for his friends. Like when my friend Steve in Little League hit his 5th home run. The first 4 were great and all, but that fifth one, we knew that he was special. Or like when little Ruby Bridgers walked into that school, a police officer on each side. Powerful people. Captured in a painting by the most well-known painter in America, so that the world could witness that. And so many people began to realize that our country could change for the better. See, transfiguration of Jesus can lead to a transformation of you. This story, if you meditate on it and think about it and stay quiet, might open your eyes to who you are. That alteration, that change, that conversion, that maturation of Jesus wasn't so much about Jesus as it was about those who loved him. Because Jesus was who he was, we can be who we're supposed to be. To be transformed is to be intimate with God. And to be transformed, we need to listen. This is my son. Listen to him. To be transformed, we have to trust God, even when the fog on the top of the mountain obscures and threatens to overwhelm. We're invited to trust God, especially in the times when we don't know where we're going. I think the good news this morning comes from 2 things. Because Jesus was who he was, we can be who we need to be. And the other one comes right at the end of the story. They're walking down the mountain. They're coming down the mountain after having experienced this thing. And Jesus tells his friends, his disciples, not to talk about what just happened. What happens on the mountain stays on the mountain. beyond the, well, of course they told, obviously they told, it's in the story that they told. Maybe we need to think about what Jesus says there, because maybe how God chooses to reveal things isn't limited by my ability to tell it. In other words, there are things going on right now. God has stuff going on that I know nothing about. And I really don't need to chime in on it. I don't need to bring my interpretation of it. I don't need to bring my experience to define what God's doing right now. I mean, it's okay to tell people what happened to me. And it's okay to be like the disciples who told their friends over and over and over and over again what happened at the top of the mountain. If they didn't, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing right now. But maybe it's not my job to grab people by the arm and pull them to God and force them to think the things that I think or experience the things that I experience. Maybe what I need to focus on is being tuned into God with me, listening, following, paying attention, letting God's story happen to me first, without defining what it needs to be for everybody else. There are times when I'm the counselor, and there are times when I need to be the counseled. And there are times when we're in our pulpits, you and I. And then there are other times that we just need to shut up for a minute or two and listen.